Hi! I'm so glad you're here. A few months ago, I was asked to create puppets and film a puppet sequence for a production of Matilda the musical. It was probably the most intense puppet project I've worked on so far, so I thought I'd share with you how I did it. We'll be talking about the plot of the musical, the movie, and the book, so if you haven't seen them or read them and you'd like to keep it a surprise, I do have a different puppet video you can watch. The show, based on the movie, and also the book, which the movie is also based on, is about Matilda, a very gifted child who is sadly neglected by her family and faces a very abusive headmaster at her school. Reading and storytelling become a very important form of escapism for Matilda, which brings us to our puppets. Throughout the show, Matilda tells her local librarian a story about two circus performers, an acrobat and an escapologist. These stories are kind of how Matilda processes her neglect, while also unknowingly uncovering truths about the life of her kind-hearted teacher, Miss Honey. Matilda's gifts extend beyond academia. They're a bit psychic in nature. Now, the concept for the puppet sequences is play. If Matilda had dolls to play with, this is what they would look like. They look a little strange because she doesn't actually have any dolls or toys, so they're all from her imagination. At first, I drew the escapologist with the shape of a key in mind, and the acrobat inspired by the shape of a swan as she gracefully flies through the air during her act. But these drawings were a little too happy and cutesy. They needed a little more stylization, something a little more weird. So I went back to the drawing board and took a lot of inspiration from the original illustrations. They have a very sketched look to them with these very simply drawn yet expressive faces. So I drew more wiry arms, dots for eyes, large noses and distinct shapes. And then for their outfits, I took inspiration from old circus performers' costumes. Once I got the go-ahead on the designs, it was time to build the puppets. To make the puppets themselves, I used two kinds of wire: armature wire for their torsos and legs, and garden wire for their arms. To make the hands and arms, I used a black garden wire and bent the ends into loopy little fingers that I'll be able to pose later. I wanted the hands and arms to look like they were drawn by a pencil or a pen and scribbled in, kind of like how kids draw hands, so I think this was really effective in communicating that. After I made the armatures, I started sculpting. These puppets needed to be hardy and survive the filming process, so I used polymer clay to sculpt their heads and necks. Sculpting such exaggerated shapes was a lot of fun, especially making the escapologist's nose and the acrobat's face, because I wanted her to have a really sweet heart-shaped face. For the acrobat, I also tried to make ballet slippers that could be posed by making a ball and socket joint. The pieces baked for about 2 hours, and after they were cool to the touch, it was time to put them together. Now, their heads actually fell off before I could bake them, so those had to be glued on afterwards, but that was okay in the end because I made their necks a little too long, so I had to use some wire cutters to clip some of the length off before I glued their heads back on. For their bodies, I added some felt padding to their torsos to build them out just a little bit and give the hot glue something to cling to once I started making their clothes. I made their costumes using fabrics from my large scrap bin under my desk. I mainly used hot glue to attach everything together, not only to the wires themselves, especially on their legs, but also on the fabric wherever there would normally be a sewn seam. The acrobat was almost done the first day, and I'm happy to say that her ball and socket feet sort of worked. I cut away some more space in the slipper so that the ball would be able to rotate more, and fed a wire through both to hinge them together. I put a felt base down for her hair, and the next day I started on the escapologist. This circus man has a striped shirt, and I knew I had the perfect scraps to use for this from my Beetlejuice dress. This dress. But I did add some little stripes in between the big ones because I thought it looked a little more sketched. I gave his sleeves purple cuffs and made his shirt short-sleeved as he is an escapologist and can't have long sleeves getting in the way or have a place to hide any tricks. For his vest and slacks, I layered some blue fabric from my dream outfit skirt with some scraps from my Agatha Harkness overlay dress, and I love the color-changing effect this fabric has when moved under the light. I thought it was perfect for a little showman. I glued on his shoes, suspenders, and little details like his buttons and collar, and while I had the beads out, I added some tassels to the acrobat's sleeves, glued some ribbon to her legs from her ballet slippers, and added beaded tassels to the ribbon as well. To accentuate the drawn and sketched look, I used black yarn for their hair, picturing each strand as a pen or a brush stroke. Putting down each individual piece was very satisfying, especially figuring out how to accomplish their very cartoony hairstyles. And I used some black hot glue to sculpt the pieces into shapes, like the escapologist's dramatic coif and the acrobat's curls. For the acrobat's bun, I covered a styrofoam and felt covered ball with some yarn, and just like that, their hair was done. Now their little polka dot eyes required my smallest paintbrush, which was actually perfect for adding some extra little sketched details around each eye as well. The last detail for the escapologist was making interchangeable mouth and eyebrow pieces out of hot glue, as he'll be needing some more expressions than the acrobat. And the idea was to be able to peel and re-stick these onto the smooth surface of the clay, and it worked pretty well. Before I started making props, I went through the script and wrote a 15-page long storyboard, listing every set piece and prop at the end of each act so I would know exactly what I needed to make. I bought 4 foam poster boards, 5 posters, and 2 dowels to make everything. The first set piece I made was the circus background, since it gets the most use, and it was the one I was most excited to make. The idea for everything is that Matilda doesn't have toys, and paper and markers might be the only thing she has access to, so I wanted an exaggeratedly hand-drawn quality to everything. I penciled in where the circus tent would be, the stripes, the audience, and the edge of the ring. I made this circus scene as colorful as possible by using a whole rainbow of acrylic paints to fill in the audience. As that dried, because I put a ton of paint on it, I cut up a poster board to use for some of the props. These props varied widely, from an outside view of the tent, to cats and dogs, to the escapologist's lock and chains, their lovely little house on the hill, confetti, and so much more. Once the circus background was dry, I put the finishing touches on it with a paint marker, making thick, scraggly lines to accentuate the hand-drawn style I wanted. All of the props required a lot of drawing, painting, coloring, cutting, and assembling. The sharks and spiky objects that the acrobat daringly flies over during her act were some of my favorite things to make. To make things movable, I used some brads from the office supply store to make joints, and this couldn't have worked better. The brads were especially useful when I made the other silhouetted puppets, like the sister-in-law and the little girl, because the movement they allowed made them so much more expressive and more fun to play with. The acrobat swing was made with a section of a wooden dowel and some more wire, and hung onto a paintbrush. Then I used some more foam board to make bigger props like a ladder, a bed, and pieces to show the little girl doing chores around the house. After everything was built, it was time to record. In order to film everything more efficiently, I put the audio files together first. I was given some backing tracks for the show, as well as some recorded audio files of the actors reading their lines, and recorded the acrobats singing parts myself. I also made sound effects after everything was filmed, but I'll just put everything regarding sound into one place. I really enjoyed making the sound effects. Then I took all of these files and put them together like a puzzle, referring to a professional recording of the stage production as a reference in order to know what order to put things in and what the timing should be like according to the music. And once those audio files were all put together, I set up my little stage in my photo corner. My projector came in handy when it came to the backgrounds, which I drew on my iPad so I could connect it directly, but outside of some specific scenes, my tripod lights and color gels were the most helpful in setting the scene and changing the tone. The base of my set was a foam board taped to the tabletop, so that I could pin set pieces directly into it. I filmed each scene depending on how I had to set up the backgrounds, so everything was filmed out of order, but still in a pretty orderly fashion, as I crossed out every scene right after recording, so I knew what had been filmed and what had not. To move the foam-based puppets, I used wire, and to move the doll puppets, I used a lot of clear polyester thread by wrapping it around their hands and pulling it up or down. For example, to have the escapologist lovingly put his hand on his wife's cheek, I started with his hand on her cheek, wrapped the thread around his hand, and slowly pulled it down. Then in editing, I reversed the film so that his hand was going up. This sometimes required mental gymnastics a circus performer would have been proud of, but it was fun to figure out. There were a few times where I lost my cool, mainly when the camera decided to focus on the faceless audience members in the background instead of the two dolls right in front of it. And the time where I realized that the acrobat's earring had broken off at some point and I had no idea how long it had been gone. But we got through it. I did have to use some interesting ways to keep everything standing, like clipping the puppets to tripods or sitting them in mugs with sewing weights shoved in the bottom. But hey, with the right camera angle, it worked. Filming their daring circus act was the most tricky, but with a little imagination and a lot of tape, I figured out how to dangle everything from the ends of various tripods and even a stepladder, and after days of filming, it was time to edit. The editing itself took far less time than I thought it would, and far less time than the filming itself, but was very enjoyable as it was like putting yet another puzzle together. And now I present to you the story of the acrobat and the escapologist. Once upon a time, there lived two talented circus performers. An escapologist who could break through any challenge, and an acrobat who flipped through the air with such grace it seemed as though she could actually fly. People came from all over, not just to see their daring feats, but to witness their love for each other. Kings, queens, celebrities, astronauts, everyone came to see the couple. Rumor had it that cats would even purr as they passed, and dogs would weep upon seeing just how much they loved each other. The couple moved into a small house on the hill and walked the town every evening. The children of the town knew once they saw the acrobat's white scarf blowing by that all they had to do was cry, "Tricks, tricks!" and the couple would put on the most incredible act just for them. They were adored, but there was an emptiness in their life that could not be ignored. "We have everything," they said solemnly, "but the one thing." They desperately wanted a child. As the years went by, the silence of their empty house grew harder to ignore, as they imagined the sounds of laughing children playing in their empty halls. To try and ignore their crushing loneliness, the acrobat and escapologist leaned into more and more dangerous acts until they announced their greatest feat ever. The burning woman, flying through the air, with dynamite in her hair, over sharks and spiky objects, caught by the man locked in the cage. The escapologist, nervous that he would not be able to escape, catch his wife, and douse the flames in time, was reminded by his wife that their loneliness had led them here. The night of their act arrived, and the audience buzzed with energy. This most dangerous, daring, terrifying act was produced by the acrobat's sister, a horribly mean woman who delighted in scaring children, and people often whispered about how jealous she was of her sister. But before the act could begin, the escapologist walked into the center of the ring. alone. He announced that the burning woman, flying through the air with dynamite in her hair over sharks and spiky objects caught by the man locked in the cage, was cancelled. The audience gasped so loudly that even a passing airplane heard it. "The act is cancelled because my wife is pregnant." The circus tent fell so silent that you could hear the burp of a fly. Then the acrobat walked into the ring, took her husband's hand, and the audience exploded into applause. The applause rolled on and on from the happy audience, but as the acrobat and escapologist moved to the exit, the acrobat's sister insisted that the trick go on as planned because they signed a contract. She had paid for everything after all. The posters, the toilets, it did not matter the risk to their lives and the life of their child. A contract was a contract. And so the acrobat and escapologist were forced to complete their most perilous performance yet. The acrobat took her white scarf and tied it around her husband's neck. "For luck," she said, before giving him a gentle kiss and throwing her arms around him in a hug so tight he thought she would squeeze all of the air out of him. And so the daring duo took their places, the escapologist in his cage, wrapped with locks and chains, the acrobat at the tip-top of the circus tent with dynamite in her hair. And once her dress was set alight, the trick began. The acrobat took off into the air, soaring over sharks and spiky objects, flipping over the audience toward her husband, who expertly escaped the chains and threw the cage door open. Reaching one hand out toward his falling wife, the escapologist grabbed a fire extinguisher with the other. As their hands clasped together, he doused the flames with foam. The fire was out, the dynamite explosion avoided, but the acrobat was still dangling from the cage. Perhaps it was nerves, or perhaps he had used too much foam. But the escapologist's grip on the acrobat's hand began to slip. And she fell. They were able to save her baby, but every bone in the acrobat's body was broken, and she was fading. "Take care of our daughter," she murmured to the escapologist. "She is everything." Then she passed. The escapologist, now raising his daughter by himself, turned to his sister-in-law for help. As the girl grew older, her terrible aunt was incredibly cruel to her, forcing her to clean, iron, cook, always enforced with severe punishment, and always behind the escapologist's back. The girl grew up with the meanest, cruelest, most awful and terrible aunt in the whole world. One day, as she cried in her room, the terrible aunt heard her, called her an ungrateful child, and threw her downstairs, where she wept and wept. That day, however, her father came home early and heard her cries. He rushed downstairs to save her. He vowed to help his daughter by confronting the terrible aunt, but he disappeared, never to be seen again. And that's how I made puppets for a production of Matilda the musical. I learned a lot throughout this process, but I would say especially when making the props and filming the entire thing. My favorite part of this, though, strangely enough, was the editing. I don't know if it's because of the puzzle-like quality that the task had, or if it's my need for instant gratification being fulfilled. Either way, putting everything together was very satisfying. Now, the version I just showed you was chopped up a little bit. A lot of it. I can't show the actual end product as it appeared on stage due to copyrighted music and lines read from the script. But what I presented here was my own summarized version of the 4-part story of the acrobat and the escapologist. During the show, the escapologist actually leaps from the screen and appears in person, and I made a shot of some rolling film with a hole cut out of the side that he popped out of, because the escapologist leaves the story to go console Matilda, who is actually crying in her room telling the rest of the story. After they sing a really sweet song, he leaps back into the film, and that's when Matilda describes that he's never seen again. Now, if you're familiar with any version of the story, you'll know why he's never seen ever again. But I wanted to let you know that while I couldn't quite show you exactly what the end product was, I did my best to summarize the story and provide some context for everything you've just witnessed come together. This footage has been sitting in my hard drive for a couple months, so I'm very happy to finally share it with you. If you enjoyed this video, you can let me know by hitting the like button, and if you want to see what I'm doing next and join the channel, hit the subscribe button, and if you want to know when I post, hit the notification bell, and YouTube will let you know. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!